Where were you during the great coronavirus scare of 2020? Well, you were determining whether or not God exists. You were examining arguments for that thing that the pious sisters in middle school told you no argument could be made for. You know who thought an argument could be made about the existence of God? Thomas Aquinas. And that's what we're looking at today. And if you ask me, where are you? I am in University Hall, room 3328, I believe. I know that the computer I was using before created that high-pitched whirl in the background, that sound that was driving some of you crazy. So I'm switching it up. I'm right here in a classroom, talking at you like we're back at St. Robert's Hall in the good old days. Okay, this is the most famous passage from Aquinas. Well, actually, I give you just a small portion of this famous passage from Aquinas. It's normally 5 paragraphs when translated into English. I gave you only the first one. And then I gave you a reading from Herbert McCabe that I think captures the essence of what this reading is about. So Aquinas thinks, let's just review for a moment. Aquinas thinks that the statement, God exists, right? What does that mean? It means that there's features of the universe which ought to be causally accounted for, but which cannot be causally accounted for by any other feature of the universe. I hope you have that memorized, because now Aquinas is going to go on to show that there are such features of the universe. There are features of the universe that cannot be causally accounted for, but which seems like they should be, but they cannot be causally accounted for by any other feature of the universe. And you say to me, give me an example. Well, the first example is change. Now, you have to get one thing in the front of your head to understand Aquinas' arguments here. Aquinas is just not interested in time. Not interested. What do I mean by that? I mean, he's interested in giving causal accounts in the here and now. So don't think of it in terms of dominoes. Don't do it. Don't think of it in terms of dominoes. You know, you hit one domino, and that hits the next one, that hits the next one, then the next one, and they fall successively, one after the other, in time. When the last domino falls, some seconds or even some minutes will have passed since the first one. And Aquinas says explicitly, not in the text you read, but he does say it. I can tell you where. It's question 46, article 2. Aquinas says explicitly that kind of succession, that can go all the way back. That can go back and back and back and back. Time can go back infinitely, he says. There's nothing incoherent about that. Whether it does go back infinitely or not, that's a different question. But it can. It's not incoherent to think that it does. You know, it's incoherent to think that you can make a triangle with less than 180 degrees. That's what I mean by incoherent. So how do these arguments work? I gave you one paragraph from Aquinas. It's the argument from change. Why is there change? Not this or that particular change. The leaves turn color. The milk goes bad. Coronavirus shuts down the university. These are all instances of change. But why change in general? Why is there such a thing as change? You see, anytime something changes, you try to explain why. You know, if you went home and you went into your room and there was a dead body on the floor that wasn't there this morning, the one thing you're absolutely not going to do is say, that happens sometimes, nobody knows why. No, you've got to explain change. Somebody killed someone and dumped him in your room. So you explain an instance of change in terms of something else. And that something else is usually, almost always, itself something that undergoes change in some way or another. So now Aquinas is asking us, what about the whole big system of change? The whole system. The fact that we live in a changing material universe. The whole universe is undergoing change. How come? That's a reasonable question if you ask Aquinas. That is a completely reasonable question. Why change? It's completely reasonable to ask why so-and-so is dead on the floor. It's completely reasonable to ask why the leaves are changing color. It's reasonable to ask why the planet is heating up. But then what happens when you ask about the whole system of change? And Aquinas' answer is A, he doesn't know. He doesn't know what answers the question, why change? B, he does know it can't be one of the changing things. If you're trying to explain the system of change, you can't point to one of the things undergoing change because that's the very thing you're trying to explain. That's the very thing that you're asking about, is the changing stuff. So he doesn't know what the answer to the question why change is. He knows it can't be itself something undergoing change. And so, remember that metaphor last time? Remember that metaphor I gave you about not being able to open the door? And so we just give a name to what's keeping it from opening? We just named it Biggles? Well, Aquinas says he has a name for the answer to the question why change. You guessed it, it's God. It's God. Now, if you haven't been paying close attention, at this point you're thinking to yourself, why can't it be something other than God? And what you've done, your mistake, it's a common mistake, it's okay. I'll tell you what the mistake is though. Is you think you know what God is, but you don't. On Aquinas' way of thinking, you do not know what God is. You have some image of God. You have some image of God that somebody put into your head when you were little. Get rid of it. When Aquinas talks about God, he's talking about the source of change, the reason that there's change at all. What else does Aquinas think about God? He thinks God answers the question, why does anything exist? Why anything at all? And what I'm giving you here is what philosophers sometimes refer to as classical theism. Let's see if I can still write on the board in here. Classical theism. We're going to see other theories of philosophy of religion in the future. Classical theism is not, for example, theistic personalism. What's the difference? Aquinas is a classical theist. For Aquinas, to talk about God is just to talk about the question, why anything at all instead of nothing whatsoever? The competing view, theistic personalism, says to talk about God is primarily to talk about an all-powerful person without a body, right? It's now, by the way, you know, if you're a theist or an atheist, you have to tell me whether you're a theist or an atheist with respect to which group. Aquinas is an atheist to the theistic personalist. He doesn't believe there's any, in fact, Aquinas says that there is no such thing as people without bodies, right? To be a person is just to be a certain kind of animal, and animals are bodies. So why Mr. Whiskers? Why is there a Mr. Whiskers? Well, we all know the story about Mr. Whiskers' parents, Mama and Papa Whiskers. They're cats also. Why cats? Why are there cats? What's up with that? And again, I'm not asking about history here. I'm asking about the here and now. Well, to explain why some of the things are cats, I have to talk about animals. But why are some of the things animals? Well, to talk about that, I have to talk about the biological organisms. Why are some of the things biological organisms? Well, now I have to talk about complex carbon-based substances. And why are some of the things complex carbon-based substances? Well, where is this line of questioning going to end? Where is the line of questioning going to end? Aquinas says it ends at the limits of what you can think, namely everything. Why anything at all instead of nothing whatsoever? And for Aquinas, if you admit that that's a legitimate question, why anything at all instead of nothing whatsoever, then Aquinas is happy to count you as a theist, as a classical theist. Just make sure that you don't pretend you know what the answer to the question is. Don't pretend you know, because what do you know? You know things that are in the universe. That's all you can know. Anything you know is going to be one of the things. So when we're asking about the question, why anything whatsoever, well, you can't point to one of the things and say, oh, that one. Because then you have to ask, why that thing? This is why, for Aquinas, it makes no sense to ask, why God? That's where your mind was going, wasn't it? You tricky people. You were going to try to trick Aquinas and say, well, what causes God? You see, if God's the answer to the question, why anything, then God's not one of the things. And therefore not one of the things you can ask, how come about? So I've given you two ways of thinking about Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God. The argument from change, which says that to explain why there's change, you have to go outside the system of things that undergo change. And I've given you an argument about existence itself. Why anything? To answer that question, you have to go outside the system of things. You have to get outside of what it is you're able to think about when you're talking about God. Very, very difficult stuff to think about. But one thing you should think about is that these arguments are valid. I sent you a handout about the argument from change. I broke the argument down into, I think it's 18 premises, something like that. Some of you wrote the definition of an argument as two statements which provide evidence for another. This argument isn't two statements, it's 18. It's a big argument. And everyone in the country, every philosopher in the world will agree it's valid. Some think it's not sound. Some think it's not sound. What does that mean? You've got to go back and review that. It means that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. But some philosophers think that at least one premise isn't true. Which one? I'm not going to tell you yet. Not going to. See if you can figure it out for yourself. See if you can figure it out for yourself. We'll get to it in a couple weeks. Actually, I'll probably get to it this. Hello, it's March 16th, 2020. I'm hoping to leave town within the next 72 hours. And so I'm getting as many of these lectures online as possible before then. And when I tell you a lecture at some point about a guy called David Hume, H-U-M-E, you'll see which premise some philosophers think is flawed in Aquinas' argument. Now, when you're thinking about Aquinas' arguments, you really want to be very careful to think about simultaneous causation. What do I mean by that? Again, we're not talking about dominoes or billiard balls. Billiard ball hits one, then it's another. I'm thinking about it this way, though. There's some steam coming up in the room from a boiling pot of water. What's making the water boil? The flame underneath of it. What's making there be a flame underneath that boiling pot of water? Gases and combustible gases in the pipes. What's making there be combustible gases in the pipes? The power station down the street. And if you destroy that power station, like that, the water will start cooling back down, the steam will dissipate. See, that's simultaneous causation. It's not causation in time. You could ask that question. I could come into the room, see the water boiling, and say, who turned on the stove? That's a temporal question. But Aquinas isn't interested in temporal questions. He's interested in scientific questions. Why is the water boiling? Don't say because Mary Beth turned on the stove. Say because there's a flame underneath it. Why is there a flame underneath it? Because of the combustible gases. Why are there combustible gases in the pipes? It's being generated by the station down the street. That's how you want to think about simultaneous causation when you're reading Aquinas. Okay, so Aquinas' arguments, I mean, they're pretty straightforward here. They're hard as heck to think about. You gotta, I mean, when you're thinking about the question, why anything at all instead of nothing whatsoever, you should be feeling some pain in your brain because it's weird stuff. Because now I've shown you, if Aquinas is right, there's something that's not one of the things, and therefore not one of the things you can think about. This is a bit of what's called negative theology. What is negative theology? Tune into the next episode of Philosophical Inquiry, because we're going to talk about divine simplicity, the ultimate exercise in negative theology. See you next time.